Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Alphabetical Fugazi, the only podcast that devotes an episode each to discussing every song in the Fugazi catalog, from Fuga A to Fuga Z. I'm your host, Ian James Wright. Joining me today to discuss the song Argument from the 2001 album The Argument is a person who's overqualified on at least two fronts to talk Fugazi. So first, as a musician, most notably of the great Washington, D.C. band and Fugazi's Discord label mates, Q and Not You. And second, in his current role as the Washington Post's pop music critic. Welcome to the show, Chris Richards.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going great. Thanks a lot. So, Chris, I think it's entirely possible that the audience for this podcast might know you better as Q and Not You, Chris Richards, than as Washington Post Chris Richards, but I'd just like to say to anyone who's unaware that you're a writer who's definitely worth following, I'd say, because, you know, not only is your knowledge of music both deep and broad, but also because you don't shy away from sometimes taking some contrary and principled stances in your writing, not to put too fine a point on why you're an appropriate guest for today's song. And of course that makes for interesting and thought-provoking reading. You know, if you don't do that, what's the point? I figure.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
I would like to ask, like, right off the top, one of those contrary stances just a few months ago, you kind of wrote about that you had, basically you have antipathy toward most podcasts. So I was a little bit surprised you were willing to participate on this one. Do you want to expand on that? Like, we're still in early days. I'm willing to take notes if you want to say what you'd like to hear.
My love of Fugazi transcends all arguments, I think. But yeah, I wrote a piece kind of against podcasts a few months ago. You know, it's obviously this form that's developing. It's a really interesting container for information and for sharing things that people feel are very near and dear to them. And I'm all for that. But I think as a listening experience, they have a very, very long way to go. And I think there's so much more experimentation that could take place in podcasting. And the piece was absolutely argumentative. And I definitely had my porcupine quills all the way out. But it kind of just came from the experience of wanting to have a really considered audio experience. So more than anything, it's just kind of like, if podcasting is going to be this, you know, new format that we make a permanent fixture in our cultural lives, I think as listeners, we have a lot more to demand from it. And that's the same kind of idea that I take to my music criticism as well. I mean, listening is so incredibly important, and it's such a powerful way to communicate so much of our humanity. So as listeners, I think we should demand the best, whether it's music or podcasting or anything that we're going to spend our intimate listening hours with should be absolutely worthy of that attention. So that's where I'm coming from. And that's why I'm not a podcaster, because I know that the way that I speak, I mean, you're hearing it right now. You know, I don't feel personally like I can express myself as well sonically speaking as I can on the page. So that's where I'm at with it personally. But I'm very happy to be here, because Fugazi, as I said, literally, I mean, they are a transcending force in my life. I mean, their music is almost a religious sort of thing for me, having grown up with it, which we'll get into. But I'm very happy to be here, and I appreciate the invite for sure.
Yeah, that sounds like a great place to start before we just jump into the song at hand. Can you tell me just a little bit about your relationship with Fugazi? Do you remember when you first heard of them or saw them or anything like that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, all these things are so formative for me. I grew up in Maryland, and a girl moved to my town in 9th grade, and she had like Sonic Youth t-shirts and, you know, Bikini Kill patches on her jacket. I didn't know what any of these things were, and she got me hooked up into all kinds of incredible music. And one of the first tapes she gave me was Fugazi, Steady Diet of Nothing. And I was just amazed that this band was so good, and the fact that they lived 45 minutes down the road was really exciting to me. And then we ended up going to see them play, and obviously anybody who got a chance to see them live knows that they were just an incredible experience, to an incredible energy kind of just blasting off that stage. And to this day, there's nothing like it. I have yet to see something that quite matches the intensity of that. So I was really hooked and on board. And then as time went on, I began playing in punk bands in the DC scene. I moved to DC proper to go to college. Q and Not You formed while I was going to school at the George Washington University. And by then, you know, it started to feel more and more like a community. Community is kind of like a substitute word I think a lot of us use to describe, you know, the gathering of the souls in the nightlife, if you will. But in the DC punk scene, it really lives up to its dictionary definition. the all ages scene actually, it works both ways. It's not just that teenagers can get into the venue to see the band. It's that older people who have been involved in it for years and years and years continue to show up and participate. And there's just this incredible continuity. And Fugazi was always at the center of it, even though they've been, pretty much inactive for so long now, almost 2 decades, right? They're still kind of this binding force in the musical community here. And they've absolutely been formative to the way I listen to music and to the way I live my life, honestly, which I know sounds kind of like hyperbolic, but I'm very happy to say is very true.
I mean, I know in Q Not You, you guys did a little bit of the sort of dual frontman thing Fugazi is known for. Do you think there was any direct relationship there or influence?
Oh, 100%. I mean, they were a massive, massive, massive influence on everything we were doing. And it wasn't just us. I think a lot of bands in the scene were kind of coming from that as well. They were just a force in our scene and kind of like this sort of map that you could follow. So from the way that they handled their politics to the way that the lyrics were somewhat oblique to the guitar tones, I mean, we were really in the thrall of them. And of course, we were trying to find our own humanity and who we were, through the sort of template that they were providing. But I mean, going back and listening to especially our early records, man, we were really, I mean, definitely a huge, huge influence. And I don't think it's anything to hide. I guess at the time, or actually in hindsight, looking back at it now too, I think about the word influence a lot in music, and a word that I sometimes prefer, and I would be grateful if anybody applied it to Q and Not You and Fugazi, is inheritance. I think it's really cool to think about musical communities as traditions that get passed down, and anybody who accused us of being a Fugazi ripoff band when we first came out, that's fine. And anybody can say what they want about music. Of course, I'm all for that. But I do think it helps to frame it, to think of it as a tradition being passed along. That's how we felt about it. And I hope that bands that took cues from us felt the same way.
I've been in a few little amateur bands, nothing noteworthy, but there are these little things I took from Fugazi. I don't think I was ever in a band that sounded like them, but when I wrote liner notes for a little record I was putting out, I would list the band members alphabetically by last name, and instead of like a lengthy list of thank you and things, I would just put thanks, and taking that directly from Fugazi because I loved the aesthetic of that.
They were so decisive about so many things, and there were so many things to notice about how they conducted themselves that it was very, very easy to adopt what they were doing as a template. And for our band, it was a great launching pad. I don't think we sounded much like Fugazi at all by the end of Q and Not You, but I think the fact that we sort of went so far afield from where we started was also true to the sort of exploratory spirit of that band as well. So, yeah.
I guess that segues perfectly into the song we're discussing today. It's the first song that we're discussing in this the sequence of this podcast that is from the album The Argument. It's also as it turns out, the most played song from the album in Fugazi's live career, about 66 times, according to some incomplete data that we have. Might be a few more than that. And it's contextually, it's the final song on Fugazi's final album. Do you have anything you wanted to say about the album as a whole and how you feel about it as Fugazi's sort of send-off?
Yeah, listening to The Argument today, it's actually the album that I feel is sort of the most articulate, the most complete, the most thorough from tip to tail of any Fugazi album. And in fact, when people have never heard of them before and they say, which one is the best? I don't know if it's my personal favorite, but I do say this might be the one that you think is the best. Or people who have never heard them before say, oh man, The Argument, it's amazing. I think for a lot of people who grew up with Fugazi, for the whole ride, or at least half the ride, you have this really powerful nostalgia or sort of nostalgic connection to the record you heard first, or the record you heard second, or the record you first saw performed live, or whatever. So for that to be the case with Argument fans, they'd have to have gotten into the band like at the very 11th hour of their existence, so to speak. But listening to it now, I mean, God, it sounds so accomplished and so thoughtful, and it's such a sensitive recording. I think all of their strengths are really at the fore with it. And I know this just sounds like I'm kind of like hyperbolically rambling, but it's just so impressive to hear a band go out like that. You know what I mean? To sort of have maybe reached a summit that they've been scaling for their entire career. And there's always been this sort of experimental energy to Fugazi albums that I really love. And I love when things kind of go wayward and sort of off the rails. I thought End Hits was an amazing album that way because it doesn't really obey the sort of previous trajectories or patterns that people had come to expect in their music. Something about The Argument is so cool to me because it feels so different, but so much, I don't know, part of a bigger continuity of the band's entire sort of trip, you know. And I think it's really astounding. And Argument is the final song. I mean, it's so preposterously poetic. It's crazy, and we'll talk more about it, I'm sure. But as an album on the whole, yeah, it just sounds so complete to me.
Yeah, that is interesting. As far as a recommendation, I guess it depends who you're talking to. I was thinking about that myself. I guess you would say it's the most indie rock sounding record in the, as far as most people use that term. I guess I would say, like, if somebody's favorite band was, like, I don't know, Death Cab for Cutie, I would be like, yeah, listen to The Argument first if you're looking for a recommendation, right? It has a certain probably mass appeal. I mean, that's definitely the wrong word, but a certain, maybe polish, a certain beauty and grace maybe that they hadn't yet accomplished. They certainly were doing new things, like those multiple percussion tracks and like strings, some like female backing vocals, really interesting stuff going on.
Yeah, the attention to detail on it is really what is astounding to me in hindsight, for sure.
Well, let's talk about some of the lyrics to this song. I dare say you would agree with me that this is one of the most prescient songs I can think of.
Yeah, freakishly so. Are you saying in the sense that it was recorded before 9/11 and then released after 9/11?
Yeah, so let me establish like a brief timeline of events for people who maybe don't quite remember things so clearly. So, of course, the September 11th attacks were 2001, and we should note, followed by immediate, like, saber-rattling rhetoric. I think we all remember the political cartoon of the bald eagle sharpening its talons and, like, let's roll and stuff like that. But this album came out the next month, October 16th, 2001. Next October of 2002, Congress passed the Authorization for Use of Military Force Against Iraq Resolution of 2002, including this language. Let me just quote briefly. Whereas Iraq both poses a continuing threat to the national security of the United States and international peace and security in the Persian Gulf region, and remains in material and unacceptable breach of its international obligations by, among other things, continuing to possess and develop a significant chemical and biological weapons capability, which we know in popular parlance as WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, continuing the quote, actively seeking a nuclear weapons capability and supporting and harboring terrorist organizations. So that was that resolution passed October of 2002, and then that following March 19th, 2003, the Iraq War begins with the, quote, shock and awe bombing campaign by the U.S. and the coalition nations, UK and others. And then the next year, in 2004, the 9/11 Commission found no, quote, evidence indicating that Iraq cooperated with al-Qaeda in developing or carrying out any attacks against the United States. And, the final capstone is no stockpiles of WMDs or an active WMD program were ever found in Iraq by any inspectors. So that's the basics of the situation. And this song that came out before all the craziness went down in our response to, what we perceived as, whatever this threat was, by Iraq mistakenly being conflated with the 9/11 attacks. This song really addresses Ian MacKay's and Fugazi's issue with the way we responded to that and the way we respond in general. That was a lot of rambling. Anything to say on that?
No. I mean, so much of this band's politics, I think, were also forged during the first, wars in the Gulf, or in the early 90s. So, but I think that obviously the American way is a way of perpetual warfare. The defense contractors need to keep making money. So on one hand, you can say, oh my gosh, these guys really predicted the future with their song, when in actuality, they were kind of observing the perpetuation of this incredibly ugly American pursuit, which is nonstop warfare and the money that can be gained from it and made from it. the thing that I love about Fugazi's music writ large, and this song is a part of it, is that it really identified the problems. And I think when you encounter punk rock, or for many people when they first encounter punk rock as an adolescent, you're going through a lot of soul searching and trying to find out who you are as a person. There's a lot of forging of identity happening. And I remember being an angry teenager and feeling, whatever, misplaced in the world, or a vague sense of general injustice, or that things are not as wonderful as they might seem, or as we're being taught in our school systems, right? But I felt like I didn't have any kind of grasp on what those things might be. Fugazi was incredibly helpful to me, because whereas most punk, I think, just kind of articulates that formless rage in a really helpful way, Fugazi crystallized it for me in a lot of ways by saying, here, this is a problem. Defense contractors are a problem. The environment being under threat is a problem. Misogyny is a problem. Street harassment is a problem. Gun violence is a problem. They identified the targets and things, found places to direct that sort of ambiguous anger that I had as a confused teenager. And they just provided an incredible amount of clarity. Now that makes it sound like their music is some kind of like activist utility or something like that. And of course it's so much more than that. But I was so grateful to kind of have the world presented to me by this band in a lot of ways. And they made clear so many of the injustices that, to a teenager who's first learning to get a sense of the world and what's out there, was incredibly, incredibly helpful. So this is another anti-war song in a long tradition of them from this band, but one that I think has such a fine point on it. And it's incredible that it's kind of like the last song on the last album. It's basically summing up decades of work to say that, there's this idea of perpetual warfare is completely unacceptable.
If I can let's look at one specific line. It's probably, to me, the most mysterious line in the song, or most open to interpretation. I don't know if you would agree, but the third line, how did a difference become a disease? Do you have any thoughts on that? What is the difference? What is the disease in this lyric?
That's great. Now, see, this is another part of the Fugazi genius, is that, they have this reputation of being this sort of like didactic band that's cramming their message down your throat. But I think as lyricists, they were so incredibly artful in terms of leaving enough space for the listener to have some kind of purchase on the meaning of the song, if you will, by keeping things not as direct as maybe many people think they do. So this is a beautiful lyric to me that I don't entirely understand, the line that you're quoting. I mean, the difference can be between people. The difference can be the warfare itself. The difference could be the fear that groups have for one another. And obviously that fear could be perceived as toxic, hence a disease. I like Fugazi's lyrics so much because they do a great job of jutting these kind of like mysterious phrases up against less ambiguous ones, because if they were just getting up there and sloganeering the whole time, people would turn their minds off. But they present you with a little puzzle and a little mystery. And I think it's an invitation to invest yourself, in the message that they're sharing with you, literally. I mean, a lot of people have this idea that Fugazi was preachy. It drives me nuts because, to me, they were such an inviting band. The whole mythology around them as like these scolds who got up on stage and said, no dancing, hold still, that's not what was happening. They were trying to prevent, crazy booted punks from yesteryear trying to like have some kind of weird hardcore reenactment 12 years later. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like like it's a Civil War reenactment or something, you know what I mean? And people taking cleats and boots to their forehead for no reason. They were protecting their audience. When Fugazi was saying no moshing, they weren't trying to be the fun police. They were trying to make sure that everyone could be equal and free in the audience, So again, this band who was so thoughtful about how to be welcoming to people and make sure that people were comfortable and could get loose and be in the moment with them as they, did this explosive thing on stage. That's such a generous thing, So whenever I encounter a Fugazi lyric that makes me scratch my head or feels like a little bit of a riddle, I just like luxuriate in the mystery, because that's like one of the little gifts that they keep giving us over and over again.
Me personally, as I was a very skinny young teenager at those Fugazi shows, so when I heard and anybody taking issue with any rough stuff happening, that was definitely on behalf of me and those like me at the time. I certainly appreciate, and I think that message really radiated out and was absorbed by the fans. Like one of my early memories about going to a punk show was seeing Fugazi, and somebody, I don't know, dropped their glasses, and everybody sort of in the raucous little pit there in front of the stage, gave him room, backed everybody up till he found whatever he had lost. So I very much appreciated that vibe. Yeah, that line. I mean, the best I can figure is, I take the title of this song, Arguments. I guess I see it as sort of ambiguous. It's saying this, this argument that the song is presenting against war, but I guess it's also talking about conflicts, between nations as an argument.
To put a third side on it too, I mean, you could also say when it breaks into the chorus and it's "Here comes the argument." I think it's basic. I read that as, or have always heard that as, here comes the argument for war. Here are the reasons we need to do this. And the song is saying, no matter what you tell me, that argument is going to be unacceptable. Warfare is unacceptable. As a human species, we must aspire to something better. So here comes the argument again, and no matter what, there's going to be a reason, some kind of rational, quote-unquote, reason to do this atrocious thing. And that argument sort of being nil as well. So
that's fantastic. I've never read it that way.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, who knows?
Yeah,
and also, wait, maybe we're all right here, and we're all wrong.
And it's interesting. Like, I mean, that the penultimate line, I guess, "I'm on a mission to never agree." Like, that gives me chills every time I listen to that lyric. Because there's something really, really, I mean, refreshing's not even the right word, but so comforting to know that somebody is out there, as somebody who's just going to be against war, trying to never agree that the kind of war we wage is going to be okay. That's not even to say that that I'm 100% sure that that's correct in all cases, but I like knowing that people like that are out there. I think it's important. We definitely have plenty of people on the side saying we should wage war at any given opportunity, and kick anyone's ass and liberate any country that's not behaving the way we think we should behave. So if there's not the antithesis to that out there, whatever compromise is going to be reached is not going to be a compromise that is sane, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. It's a super, super powerful lyric, and one that it's interesting that you use the word comfort too, because there is something strange about songs like this that are sort of galvanizing, and they're inspiring, and they motivate you to action, but they also sort of, I don't know, calm the nerves in a moment when anxiety is running high. You know what I mean? There's something really cool about a clarifying call to arms, and I don't want to use the word relaxing because that's not what it is, but it's clarifying might be the word I'm looking for here. This idea that that this sort of, I don't know, a call to action and trying to motivate people to step up and fight against this atrocious power at play. The fact that can be a clarifying feeling as well as a rousing one at the same time, that's so awesome to me.
Some years ago I read or I saw online an interview with the Dalai Lama. I wish I had thought of this before recording so I could have looked it up. But, basically in this interview, the Dalai Lama conceded, like, yes, there are times that, to affect the greater good, a country might have to make war. A country might have to invade preemptively to, preempt suffering, whatever. And I read that interview and I thought of this song and I thought, Jesus Christ, even the Dalai Lama can't simply be against war in any situation. Ian Mackay can, Fugazi can, and that's, like I said, that's a comfort to me.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating.
And I did want to point out, etymologically speaking, the word mission comes from the Latin word to send. So etymologically speaking, you don't just go on a mission, you get sent on a mission. Now, I'm not saying, Chris, that Ian MacKaye is some sort of a divinely sent figure to do good works on Earth. And I'm certainly not suggesting that he wrote the line with that in mind, but I am just saying it's sort of fun to read it that way. That's all.
That's interesting. I like that.
We brought up, that it is the last song on Fugazi's last album. One thing I sort of like about it, if I can make a little bit of a right turn, how do you feel about, at the end of the Beatles' Abbey Road, Her Majesty? I've found that there are a lot of people there who don't like Her Majesty after the end. A lot of people who do like it. Do you have a take on that?
I guess I've never really thought about the question until now. I guess I don't object to it. Yeah.
The end is sort of this grandiose, sprawling, song with a perfect resolution at the end. They're singing harmonies. Then Her Majesty is this sort of on the surface throwaway ditty. But personally, I always liked the way that it looks to the future. And they sing Her Majesty, someday I'm gonna make her mine, and that's the last recorded song of their career. This thing they're going to do in the future, and that's strangely enough like something I like about this song too. It's here comes the argument. I'm on a mission to never agree. It's like it's looking into the future, and it's formulating plans and saying this isn't ending with the band. This is continuing.
Totally, the work continues. Absolutely, I was gonna say that's very fundamental message that this problem was here before they showed up, and it's gonna be here after they're gone, and it's on all of us to kind of continue fighting against it for sure. In terms of futurity, that's a really awesome way to hear the song. I absolutely am with it. Here's a question I have for you. I have not a pet theory, but an overriding theory that I'm trying to integrate into all my listening, which is that a song's meaning does not reside exclusively in its lyrics. There are still messages being sent with tone and timbre and rhythm, and it not everything boils down to what's coming out of the vocalist's mouth in a literal way. Now, of course, I haven't done enough homework here and put enough thought bubbles into it, but what do you hear when you hear this song in terms of the mood and the texture of it? Do you feel that it supports the message of the lyrics, and how? I know that sounds like I'm asking you to write an essay or something right now, but what are your thoughts on this?
The immediate thing that comes to mind for me is a certain vulnerability, because I think Ian MacKaye is a lot of the time on this album he's doing a style of singing he hadn't really done before, which is to say actual singing. I think he was always better known as somebody who would scream, shout, growl, etc. But here this is a real it's a real exemplar of the kind of thing he's trying in the argument and the kind of thing he would do later in his following band, the Evens. And he's not what you'd call a quote unquote good singer. Like he couldn't go on American Idol and get anything but kicked off stage. But especially when he sings the lines or the words disease and release, those lines, he sustains the note, and it's sort of it's weak and warbly, but in a sort of beautiful and vulnerable way that I really appreciate. He's not hiding behind anything. He's putting his real voice out there.
Yeah.
It's sort of singing plaintively about this huge concern that he has.
One idea that just popped into my head right now too is that when you think of soft singing like that, a lot of times, and maybe it's just because I'm a relatively new parent, but I think about lullabies, and I was recently trying to iron out this idea that I'll put in a story at the Post someday, but this idea of lullabies being inherently futuristic. You were literally trying to comfort someone to prepare them for the future, and that's something that an idea that just popped into my mind right now through this conversation. So I appreciate that. I wanted to ask you also. Now I'm doing the interview. Sorry. What do you make of that bridge when things kind of get aquatic and underwater, and there's that beautiful little kind of thrumming? Not quite a guitar solo, but you know what I'm talking about. Before everything cuts out and the riff comes back in. What do you make of that part? The little segue there.
It's a little scary sounding, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's something that could be in almost the soundtrack of a horror film or something. Maybe that's I haven't followed Brendan Canty's career exactly very closely since Fugazi, but I know he did a lot of soundtrack work, and I guess experimented with some more maybe ambient stuff like that. But It's real beautiful. I don't know. I don't have a theory about that, but I do like it for sure.
Yeah. Well, let's direct our listeners to go listen to it and formulate their hypotheses. The last little musical part, too, that I think is really interesting and I'm trying to make sense of is I think it's Guy's guitar line for like the final outro. It's that kind of like solo that falls like a little bit out of tune and like a little bit behind the beat in this perfect way. And it kind of sounds like almost like, I don't know, regal trumpets like failing at their at their attempt, you know, like there's some kind of like malformed grandeur to it. Do you know what I'm talking about? I don't want to sing it over the podcast, but it's like it's that kind of, and it kind of just it kind of falls just out of tune sometimes, and it falls just behind the beat in a certain way that I can't stop listening to it. I get really fixated on it when that part kicks in. And I'm just like, what is the message in this guitar line? Like, what is happening here? And again, too, then I start to get back to like my other hypothesis. Not to be like I listen to all music and press theories up against it, but like this idea that we were talking about earlier of the ambiguity of a lyric having meaning and being an invitation. Like, obviously, sound is ambiguous. It's a vibration of air, and it's mysterious to us always. But whenever they took those sort of sonic left turns in terms of timbre, tone, whatever, pitch, I love those little sort of mysteries that pop in, especially in a moment of that song where everything is so triumphal and kind of like, you know, send it on home. I love that little guitar part because it just adds this kind of like question mark over the whole proceedings.
I almost regret having already named this podcast, but because I think malformed grandeur, as you put it, is a great descriptor of a lot of Fugazi's recorded output. Yeah, that's true. And also the after the little scary bridge, there's that, I guess it's Ian just hitting those chords on his guitar and sort of bending the neck. That always like scared me a little watching them live, because like those SGs that Ian plays, they're like such thin guitars, and he's just like bending it so far that you can hear the notes just go way in and out of pitch. I was like, he's gonna break that thing someday.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that all. Well, there's definitely one thing that I wanted to bring up finally, a little intertextuality that because every time I listen to this song, especially the lines toward the ends, right, it's all about strikes now. So here's what's striking me: that some punk could argue some moral ABCs when people are catching what bombers release. So that idea, that sort of logic and your rational arguments pale in the face of this destruction of human life. It always makes me think of this short poem, if you'll just indulge me, by Sharon Olds. It's called The Issues. There's a note, Rhodesia, 1978. So I guess this is about the Bush War, which is a very complicated conflict that I don't pretend to really know about. But yeah, Sharon Olds, The Issues, goes, "Just don't tell me about the issues. I can see the pale spider-belly head of the newborn who lies on the lawn, the web of veins at the surface of her scalp, her skin gray and gleaming, the clean line of the bayonet down the center of her chest. I see her mother's face, beaten and beaten into the shape of a plant, a cactus with gray spines and broad, dark maroon blooms. I see her arms stretched out across her baby, wrist resting heavily, still, across the tiny ribs. Don't speak to me about politics. I've got eyes, man."
Wow, that's awesome.
Pretty good, right?
I haven't heard it before. That's incredible.
I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of poetry, but that one has stayed with me, and every time I listen to the song Arguments, that pops into my head.
That's really cool. That's really cool. The lyrics that you mentioned from the song earlier too, not to say here's how I hear it, because we hear it, I mean, obviously the whole point of this conversation, I guess, is to triangulate meaning out of hearing different things. But I always heard some punk arguing moral ABCs, why people are catching what bombers release, was about the idea of the sort of internecine politics of the punk world, and how Fugazi, by leading by example and doing so many bold things, this isn't what I think the lyric is about, but I know as a fact that by doing that, they made themselves like targets for criticism. And if the show went up from $5 to $6, people start to freak out. You know what I mean? Rather than going out and demanding, improvements across the board in the scene and in the nightlife or whatever. Let's just hold this one band to an impossible standard and just badger them for it. So I think I always heard it in my mind as like how the sort of activist world or the punk world can maybe sometimes get lost in its own internal arguments when in fact, catastrophic death is happening, on our dime and on our time in other countries, and maybe sort of asking people to quote unquote see the bigger picture, if you will. And that's something I think about with Fugazi all the time now. And I'm really eager to listen to more episodes of your podcast and hear how this pans out. Because I think by and large, like the more I hear people talk about them, mostly on social media, I guess I should say, it seems like their legacy is like really misunderstood by people. We talked earlier about how they have this reputation as these sort of like hall monitors who are yelling at their audience all the time and telling them not to dance. Obviously, that's totally wrong. And I think there was this idea that they were incredibly like just mercilessly didactic about their politics and like cramming it down people's throats all the time. I countered that that's not true, and their lyrics afforded space for the imagination, what you will. And I wonder, but I just think like the cool part about that line to me being in this sort of farewell song is that it is like about like, don't argue about what, I don't know, whether or not Fugazi like believed in electricity or not, you know what I mean? Like their legacy should be thinking about the bigger picture. There was some New York Times story, I think it was, about Beto O'Rourke, and it really sort of like was dismissive about like, oh, he liked Fugazi and like the political things that they liked. And it's like, oh, really? Like Fugazi was concerned with the issues that cripple this country to this day. You know what I mean? They were fighting fights that still need to be fought in 2019 with all of our energy. So this idea that they were some kind of like, I don't know, band for college activists to get into and feel self-important is preposterous to me. So I feel like the band is really largely misunderstood by a lot of people, and they were trying to alert us to more cataclysmic things that were happening around the entire planet. And that lyric to me is a really beautiful thing to put in this sort of swan song from them, to say, remember, like, instead of just having this tiny discussion, amongst our community, let's remember that this whole species is dependent on us sticking up for each other.
I think I'm probably going to let you have more or less the last word on that because very well put. One last thing that we like to do on the show, ratings.
Do you like me? Do you like me? Do you like me?
If I could prevail upon you, and I know you're not the type of critic who usually gives numerical ratings to things, but I thought I'd ask you, if you'd like to, rate this song, Argument, purely in the context of Fugazi's catalog, from basically 1 to 5 stars, 1 being your least favorite Fugazi song, 5 being your most. Would you like to put this on the scale?
Oh, man. It'd be so hard for me to, because Fugazi gets 5 stars all the time from me for every song. I feel like so much of what they did, and I don't mean to be difficult or to negate your system, but I really feel like so much of what they did is part of a continuity, and that's again why I'm so interested to listen to your podcast as it goes on too, because songs they blend into each other. Obviously on stage they were very adept at literally blending songs into one another and kind of like trying to read each other's minds and do this mental telepathy thing, because as famously we all know, they didn't have a set list whenever they went on stage, and it was just sort of this like anything goes scenario where they're trying to read cues from each other and sort of enter this sort of group mind, if you will. So their songs to me, like ranking their albums, and I know I said earlier people will say, which one's the best one? Which should I start with? I just think like it's so good to hear their music as a whole. And the thing that is interesting about this song is it comes later in time. If you listen to these albums in their sequence, it comes at the end. So there are like certain parameters that give it sort of its air of finality and closure and farewell, if you will. But at the same time, I think it's so much more powerful to kind of listen to it in this blended context. It's not like they closed every show that they played after they wrote this song with Argument. It appeared in all those set lists, but it appeared all over the place. I want to say that they opened with it once or twice. Fact check me on that, people out there. But I think the best way to listen to this music really, really is as a whole. And of course, taking it apart and examining the pieces like we're doing in this conversation is awesome. But I think the more you think about anything we talked about today, and hopefully anything that you're going to continue to talk about as this podcast goes on, it's just going to enrich your knowledge of all the other music that they made. And really, honestly, all music in general. For me, this band was so formative, and hearing the adventurousness that they had and the energy that they had, the sort of questing spirit to go into unknown places as musicians while still holding on to all this really deep political conviction and the way that they felt about the world we live in is so inspiring to me still to this day. And it really just set me on the course to be an avid listener and to listen broadly, and to listen to humanity as a whole and to really give things a shot and be open and be wide open as you can. I mean, think about how stringent punk was, when this band started. There were a really widely perceived set of rules that had to be obeyed. And this band threw a lot of those things right out the window, and we're all so much better for it. So that's a big dodge to your ratings question. But I really think that the entire endeavor is a 5-star thing, and letting yourself travel from one song to the next and taking what you learn with you into the next piece of music that you hear is such an invaluable experience. And I recommend it to all.
That's really well said. I do have a feeling that over the course of this podcast, more often than not, it's going to be tough to get people to rate these songs. I'm gonna forge ahead for the time being to see if it continues to bear fruit. For my part, I I agree with everything you said. If I had to do it, I was wavering between for myself 4.5 and 5 stars. I think for this one I have to go with 5. I'm not gonna go ahead and just give everything 5. I'm going to do my best to be as critical as I can. But this song with not many lyrics just makes me think about so many things. It might not be sonically the platonic ideal I have of Fugazi song, but there's just this richness that I can't help myself. It forces me to think about things and really concentrate on where the lyrics are going every time I hear it. So 5 stars for me for this one, and we'll see if this whole ratings thing collapses a little bit down the line. So, Chris, again, thanks a ton. Let's do a little bit of plugs. Where can listeners reach you? Do you have anything coming up you want to plug? I understand you have a new band with some new music out. Anything? I'm
very busy, so I guess I have a lot of things to say here. My criticism appears regularly on WashingtonPost.com. I put all of it on the social media site Twitter, which my handle is Chris, C-H-R-I-S, then 2 underscores because my name is common, Richards, R-I-C-H-A-R-D-S. So all my work goes up there. I have a new band that I'm playing in right now called TK Echo. It's with Aaron Leko from Protect You. It's with Fiona Griffin from Meltdown, It. It's with Josh Blair, who has played in Super System and Orthorealm and other groups. We have a 3-song EP out now, and we're hoping to record more songs before the end of this year, fingers crossed. And I also, last thing I'll say is I do like a DIY fanzine called WC Ringtone. I also post about it on Twitter, but it is a 3-dimensional object only. It's not online anywhere. You can order copies through like Venmo or PayPal, and I mail them to your house. Each issue is a dozen micro interviews and nano essays about music, arts, culture, things I saw on the street, stories about strange incidents and what have you. And it comes out quarterly. And those are the 3 main things that I'm working on in the public world. And thank you so much for asking.
Awesome. Sweet. If I could plug one thing on your behalf, if people want to go back a little in the past, you did this solo project under the name Ris Paul Rick, R-I-S, Paul, R-I-C.
Yeah.
And once or twice I was in a band and I opened for you while you were doing that. And I got to say, still, I'll be just cooking in the kitchen and the title track to Purple Blaze just comes on in my head. It's one of those things that you chant and it just gets into you. So that stayed with me.
Thank you so much for that. That's awesome. Yeah. I'm so glad to hear that the music is still with you. This is something that is astounding to me, and I'm so grateful for that. The fact that we made music that resonated with anybody in the first place and then still has any place in their mind all these years later is so meaningful to me. So thank you for saying that. I really appreciate that.
You're most welcome. Well, listeners, as for me, You can reach me at fugaziA2Z@gmail.com, and you can join the Facebook group, the Alphabetical Fugazi. Chime in about this song. I'm sure there's plenty to say that hasn't even been said over the course of this recording. So go ahead and do that, and then I hope you'll join me for the next episode. We'll be discussing Arpeggiator. Until then, keep your eyes open.
This is my last picture.